Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and explains 5 outstanding books on some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. In 1965, Paul VI published the encyclical letter Mense Maio. At the beginning of that encyclical, he explains how the month of May is almost here, a month which the piety of the faithful has long dedicated to Mary, the Mother of God. Our heart rejoices at the thought of the moving tribute of faith and love which will soon be paid to the Queen of Heaven in every corner of the earth. For this is a month during which Christians, in their churches and their homes, offer the Virgin Mother more fervent and loving acts of homage and veneration. And it is the month in which a greater abundance of God's merciful gifts comes down to us from our Mother's throne. End of the quotation. 6 months prior to issuing this encyclical, St. Paul VI had promulgated the Second Vatican Council's dogmatic constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium. That dogmatic constitution ends with a chapter on the Blessed Virgin Mary, where the Council Fathers reiterate the Church's teaching on devotion to Our Lady and the characteristics of that veneration. In this interview, Colin B. Donovan proposes 5 books on Marian devotion. Colin B. Donovan is Vice President for Theology at EWTN and was host of EWTN Theology Roundtable. Prior to coming to EWTN in 1995, he taught theology at Aquinas College in Nashville. He is a member of the Mariological Society of America and the Pontifical International Marian Academy. Links to the titles recommended in this episode can be found in the show notes. Colin Donovan, welcome.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Devotion to Mary is founded upon Mary's special status within the Church and the economy of salvation, as revealed through the apostolic tradition and Scripture. Why is theological reflection on the Mother of Jesus, or Mariology to give it its technical name, important?
Well, I think it's important to be well-rooted. And in sort of reviewing the books I suggest for this, I read something that St. Alphonsus Liguori wrote about what is for him a very devotional work. And he made the point which I would normally make as well, and that is that anything that is Catholic, even if it's simply devotional, has to be read through the lens of the sacred tradition and the sacred Scripture and the Church's teaching about it. And that's the only way to draw out of it what is the foundational fact of all of Catholic belief, and that is divine revelation. Theologians can speculate and theologians can propose solutions, but in the end, it's the consistency of that speculation with the deposit of the faith which will determine whether something is truly valuable universally to Catholics in the Church. So I think that's the importance of Mariology, is to get all of that right so that the rest of the Church, in reflecting on perhaps a less scientific level, Mariology being a science as Thomas Aquinas would have defined any of the theological disciplines, but that people get that right framing of the matter within the faith of the Church and not distinct from the faith of the Church.
The dogmatic constitution of the Second Vatican Council, Lumen Gentium, asked theologians and preachers to abstain zealously both from all gross exaggerations as well as from petty narrow-mindedness in considering the singular dignity of the Mother of God. That's Lumen Gentium number 67. Mm-hmm. What sorts of gross exaggerations or petty narrow-mindedness about Mary are around today?
Well, I think there's a lot of things which we seem to be an age of polarities. You're staking out positions at one end or the other. And sometimes the positions are fueled perhaps by a particular interest or devotion, or I look at something which the Pope recently instructed the Pontifical International Marian Academy on, and that is to to sort of curb a kind of apocalypticism, which people sometimes latch onto because it's sort of the spangly bauble of private revelation. It seems to be predicting the future and things like that. So on the personal level, on the level of the Catholics, that would be it. But then there are also theological speculations that can fit into that as well, explanations of history which wish to conform to new ideas and so on, which are not rooted in the sacred scripture and the sacred tradition, as I mentioned. So I'm trying to think of one. There's a lot of discussion today regarding, well, when is the end of the world? Is the Antichrist around the corner and things like that on the popular level? But the church gives a very solid theological structure, eschatological, and I think as well as Marian. Now, those two aren't meeting very well quite yet. The eschatological you can find in the Catechism at the beginning at paragraph 668. It takes the fathers of the church and it lays out the order of history. The Mariological you find in someone like de Montfort, where he talks about what he sees as a necessary Marian role for the end of history. And in that you can fit things like Fatima and St. Faustina and others. But the question is, when people propose things of that nature, that effectively regarding eschatology, but they drag Our Lady into it and they try to demonstrate points from her with regard to predictive matters and things like that. So there aren't many theologians doing that, but I think there are a lot of laity trying to do that who are not grounded in eschatological, for example, and in de Montfort's sense of Mary's relationship to that. And so, I can't think of any technical issues. It might be the question of Mary as co-redemptrix, for example, which has a lot of traction in the tradition, in the usage, for instance, of the Marian Missal. Many things in the 2-volume Marian Missal that we have in the United States, for example, approved by Rome, of course, speak of that, but not without that term. And so the debate becomes where, to take an idea and to proclaim it without the necessary theological consideration and development that would sort of produce that at the end of a pathway of doing theology, or to take the opposite position. And it's interesting that Liguori talks about this when he talks about his 7 categories of devotion to Our Lady, in which you have everything from the skeptical to the more extreme. And so I think that text was probably speaking to a time when in the context of Fatima, in the context of the age in which we live, there were extreme positions being spoken of and written about, and the church wants to put a damper on that. And in the recent pontificates, we have had that same effort, whether it's Cardinal Ratzinger's theological commentary on Fatima, or as the Pope has recently said on some of these kinds of matters as well. In the end, there is a patience in theology which is sometimes lacking in the extreme position. And I think the council was speaking to theologians and therefore was asking for that same patience in dealing with the kinds of issues which tend to be, in the public sphere, tend to get amplified and become, well, you either accept this because it's so obvious, isn't it? Or that's so ridiculous, reject it. No, let theology do its work, and out of this, the church will decide and draw conclusions. So I think the context of Fatima, or the context of Vatican II there, is probably the debate between two views of these issues. Some of whom wanted to run ahead with conclusions, and others who were maybe a little bit minimalist on Marian things. And in the end, the Pope resolved that with his own chapter 8, as it were, dealing with Marian, affirming all the things which were traditional and well settled, and nothing pretty much beyond that.
You were appointed in 2023 to the Pontifical International Marian Academy. What tasks or initiatives does this institute carry out?
Well, one of them is obviously the theological work, and I think for most of the membership, it's what they do every day, maybe in seminaries or theologates around the world, or in conjunction with bishops in curias or in Rome itself with the curia there. And so it's that kind of work. But more generally, there is this area that was named by the Pope, and I think it was coming out of the new curial organization, which was meant to be evangelical. So to preach the gospel was the name of that document where he reorganized the curia. And I think as part of that, it's to keep in all of the work of the Holy See this central feature of what will lead people to Christ. And that's an important Marian theme, because after all, the great writer on this, de Montfort, spoke specifically of going to Jesus through Mary, and gave in his writing on true devotion, as well as, principally there, he gave how that is to be accomplished. And so that's still a task that has to be inculcated into the church. Now, there are other things related to that. The apocalyptic point I mentioned, where the dicastery, or rather the academy, wants to, under this mandate, to be available to dioceses and others who have mystical phenomena or claims of apparitions and so on, to make that discernment, to sort of have field workers to gather that data and forward it to the academy. So that's one of the tasks. The interreligious dialogue is another one. I was very impressed. My appointment, the documentation was very recent, but was actually a few years ago. And I took part in the Congress that was done by Zoom during the COVID pandemic. And in that, I was very impressed by a comment with respect to the Muslims, which was made by a member who is, I believe he was a Maronite, he might have been Melkite, but of an Eastern Rite, who is in Lebanon, who said at the principal Marian shrine in Lebanon, there are more Muslims who visit it than Christians, because obviously there are huge numbers of them in the Middle East and Syria and Lebanon. But there is some way of beginning a dialogue with Mary that can't be done on other subjects, and it's begins, I think, with that devotional element, because that's the way into the hearts of people. That's where hearts are going to be changed, by their devotion, by their prayer life, not by theologians developing formulas and explanations of things, as important and necessary as that is. So I thought that was a very touching story that he had regarding how the church can have a dialogue about Mary with Islam. And with our Protestant brothers, similar reports. The devotion of the English nation to Our Lady historically is well known. The twin shrines that are present there to Our Lady, and one for the Anglicans, one's for the Catholics, and the number of Anglicans interested in Mariology as well. So that's another area where the academy can get more deeply and profoundly into that work of evangelization, I think, because ultimately the objective is to get Jesus Christ to people. But Mary's very happy to be a door for that, and presents herself as that, and we're asked to do that, along with the normal tasks. And then there can be other invitations to participate in in the works of the academy, as it's invited by the Curia, by the Holy Father, and so on. I myself has not done anything of that nature yet, but those are always a possibility for the membership.
with the definition of the dogmas of the Immaculate Conception and the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, has Mariology reached the limits of its development?
Well, I think yes and no. We take many of the other things which follow from that, from the Assumption. We've inferred the coronation, for example. But I think every one of those things have a great deal that is implicit in them. After all, Mariology, one would say, like the theology of the lay vocation, is sort of something that's been slowly gaining steam in the church. The more critical issues of Christology and ecclesiology and sacramentology and so on have developed more quickly in the church by a certain necessity as being related directly with the core activities of the church. But other things which are true simply as well have come along late. A theology of marriage with the great impetus of Pope John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, for example, and Dietrich van Hildebrand and others. So these things have developed more slowly. And I think in Our Lady's case, a lot was held early in the church, as we find in the fathers of the church, but not explicitly developed in formulas except these basic things: the perpetual virginity, the Immaculate Conception, the Assumption, and so on. So co-redemptrix and how to explain this participatory role in the redemption, which was by a necessity given to Our Lady by the will of the Father in choosing her to be the vessel, the mother of the Word made flesh. The full implications of that, I don't think we've dealt. That gets a lot into the deeper scriptural discussion of Mary in the sacred scriptures. Mariologists could find her pretty much everywhere in the heroic women of the Old Testament, certainly in Genesis, in the first chapters. That has a long history from the fathers and so on. But I think there's a good deal there to develop by reflection in the church as well. But in the end, it's fleshing out the things we already possess, and we continue to do this in other elements of Christology and soteriology and so on. Especially in application, in the pastoral side, in moral theology, in the pastoral side. So that work will continue, and I think there is to be done, but a lot to be done. But perhaps this last one of this relationship, which comes to Our Lady by her participation, by what I think has to be universally considered the central establishing dogma of Mariology, which was the decision of Chalcedon that Christ was, or Ephesus as well, that Christ was a divine person who with a divine nature, who assumed a human nature. And the full implications of that Mary was chosen as his mother, and chosen by all the preparation before and all the graces given during her life, and the prerogatives that she attained after her life as well, such as the Assumption, and to flesh that out completely so that Christology and Mariology are one, and Mariology in its proper role at the service of Christ, of Christology. So there's a good deal of work to be done there, and I think that there will be a lot done in the future.
Often, many of our Protestant brethren are suspicious of Catholic devotion to Mary and the saints. They fear that it is not sanctioned by Scripture and betrays a lack of faith in the sufficiency of Christ's redemptive work. Why have you not recommended any books that address their concerns primarily and explicitly?
Well, because I was thinking primarily among how I came to a deeper faith and a more scientific faith in Our Lady. Faith, of course, is communicated by baptism. It has to be fostered. The Protestants receive that faith. They receive a lot of bad information. That has to be undone. They have to be won over. And we recently had one of our local priests who was Anglican priest, Episcopal in the U.S., and he had become Anglican use and had come into the Catholic Church. And he explained his own process of getting over the kinds of objections that Protestants have. And we have a program, the Catholic Sphere, where we discuss that with them on EWTN. And, in doing that, there is, and I think many converts over the years that, for instance, we've had on the Journey Home, our TV, our program regarding the Protestants, usually intellectuals or pastors or others who have come into the church. There is always getting over the polemics. They're not ill-willed polemics. They're based on certain presumptions regarding what Scripture is saying and therefore not saying. And all of that has to be undone. But he noted that probably devotion to Our Lady is what brought him over, not wrapping his head around the theological principles. That was important once he had that attraction was responded to. But that gets back to the point I was making about the interreligious dialogue, that you get people by the attractiveness of Our Lady, the goodness of Our Lady, and the fact that this priest felt he had been reached out to by her in many ways. Raised in an area of the United States where he described the image of Mary in the bathtub kind of thing, somebody planting something on their front lawn to show that they had Marian devotion. And of course, that was easy for Protestants to caricature. But they didn't understand how deeply Our Lady was, and therefore her son, in the life of the people who did those kinds of things, who manifested that Marian faith. So there are certainly books that attempt to do that, and for the more intellectual non-Catholics, there are formal Mariological texts that address those issues. But for the typical non-Catholic Christian, I think the way of devotion and the conviction of that regarding that doesn't require a lot of technical argumentation. If we simply give and encourage people to have for Our Lady the respect and the honor that we give to our own mothers, asking ourselves, what respect and honor must Jesus have given to his own mother? And St. Louis de Montfort notes this in True Devotion. He spent, up until his public ministry, we can consider that he spent his life in obedience to his mother, as he had done to St. Joseph during his life. And that tells us more about the will of God than our intellectualism. And so I think that's why devotion inspires those common ordinary inflections and not a lot of technical writing. So I concentrated, as I told you before the show, in making that list in terms of a devotional pathway that led me to a more scientific pathway. And I think for most people, unless they're an intellectual, that's going to be how she hooks them and draws them close to her and through her to her son.
The first book you recommended is William T. Walsh's book on Fatima. Why have you chosen this as an entry point into devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary?
I think because I was searching my mind for the first book formally about Our Lady that I read, and I remember, as I've mentioned in interviews in connection with my appointment, I remember the Sisters of Zion, who ran a kindergarten in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, in Canada, where I was born. And so in kindergarten, I was sent there, and this was in the late 50s, and the sisters spoke really of two Marian things. They spoke about Fatima, which was the cause du jour, or the topic du jour in the 50s and 60s because of the promises and the prophecies in Fatima. And they talk about their own founders, Alphonse Ratisbonne, and the miraculous medal, and his conversion from being an atheistic Jewish man to being a Catholic, becoming a priest, and founding male and female orders to bring devotion to Our Lady to the Jewish people. And so this was a book that I came across. I believe it was in my mother's library sometime in the 60s. And it would have been the first formal thing that I read, other than what I got in, religious education classes in school. And I thought it was interesting because he made, there's the science of Mariology, but there's also historical science. And although the author was a professor of literature, he had been writing biographies of famous people, Isabella of Spain, Teresa of Avila, and a number of others. And so he wanted to go back to the beginning and to get a history of the event, which in the 50s was known after a fashion in the United States, but not really known in depth. And there was nothing significant in English other than, some pamphlets and things passed around by, different Catholic groups and so on. So that's what he did. He went over there with the help of the Bishop de Silva, who was the actual bishop who authorized the cultus of Our Lady of Fatima in 1930, with the assistance of the Patriarch of Lisbon and others with historical knowledge, such as Father de Marche, who had already written books of Fatima, but in Portuguese. And so this was the first book, and it was a particularly good account. It was trying to get at the what actually happened, to use the accounts as the children themselves gave them in multiple interviews to clergy, either before the formal beginning of a process there to study Fatima by the diocese, and then afterwards in various interviews given for that effect, and in fact a total of 6, I believe, over the course of the couple decades after the event. So he wanted to give that information. So it was to get at the facts of the matter. And like in theology, where divine revelation, as present in scripture and tradition, are the facts of theology, the faith of the church obviously defining what those facts mean, this was the facts about a private revelation. And so it was endlessly fascinating. Now, there are other books. De Marche's books are out. There are critical editions in Italian and Portuguese and one English volume from the Shrine in Fatima that are put together by theologians, sponsored by the Pontifical International Marian Academy. So there are other more scientific in the underlying sense of that since then that are available in English. But this was for me the introduction and my first fascination with the subject, I guess you could say, other than that which the Sisters of Zion had communicated to me in kindergarten. So at this point, this was a long way from kindergarten, but I'd have to trace those steps of interest on the path of this book.
Obviously, you've mentioned this book because it was your entry point
right
into devotion to Our Lady. But will it be the proper entry point for many others who perhaps don't feel that so drawn towards Our Lady of Fatima? What would you say to them?
Perhaps not. I think Our Lady can draw people through other books. I think for many Catholics, this assumes a certain devotion already. But the 2 de Montfort books I mentioned, Secret of the Rosary and the True Devotion, again from my own perspective of spiritual itinerary, anything Marian is generally going to inculcate an encouragement to pray the Rosary, and if you do that, you will develop a love of the Rosary. So the Secret of the Rosary is a good to get to an understanding of of its value, and to see in 50 chapters his approach to understanding the mysteries and the purpose of saying the Rosary. So that was as it were my next step. But a book probably on true devotion might be something that would be attractive to at least an ordinary Catholic, maybe not to a non-Catholic, but I would even suggest that non-Catholics read it for the amount of effort that he puts into disabusing the falsehoods said about Marian devotions and practices and her role and so on. So, of those two books, The Secret of the Rosary is more clearly devotional. The True Devotion, which is an encouragement that some choose the path to choose the path to go to Jesus through Our Lady as the first disciple, as you will, as the one who most conformed to the will of God from the moment of her fiat to her under the cross and to the end of her life, to take that as an example of why I ought to do it as well. And he gives the motivations, he gives the counter arguments and the against the polemics. And so true devotion might be the most packed and the most well-rounded in that sense of being, there's something in there for the ordinary Catholic who wants more. There's something in there for the person who's looking to see as a Catholic, well, why do I need to bother with devotion to Mary? And there's something in there for the skeptic to see, well, what are these Catholics really saying about her that would be different than I as an Episcopalian, as I as a, Lutheran or whatever. What's interesting, of course, is that even Episcopalians and Lutherans and others say the Rosary. So for them, the Secret of the Rosary might be a good way in as well. For the Baptist and those who's, not a member of the liturgical or sacramental churches, that any of those books on my list would probably be not very attractive. But I think they can always start with the scripture and ask themselves the question, how is Mary understood in sacred scripture? And over the years, I've seen many a Protestant going on the journey home and elsewhere who said, might even go to Scott Hahn's book on Our Lady, for example, as a notable convert, who found that the Catholic view of Mary is not at all what I took it to be. So maybe some of those conversion stories from a Scott Hahn or a Pat Madrid or somebody like that, or anybody who has walked that path, would be more suitable to the non-Catholic. But I would say after they've, dipped their toe in the water, something like True Devotion would probably give them also a good basis for understanding what Catholics really think about Our Lady.
And the books you've recommended by Saint Louis-Marie Grignon de Montfort and Saint Alphonsus Liguori, who's a doctor of the Church,
right,
were written during the Baroque period. Some readers might be put off by the style and idiom of these works and prefer modern literature that conveys the same doctrine in a more approachable manner. What advice would you give to such a reader?
Well, I would say their presumptions are wrong if they actually read those books, but I understand what you're saying. The language of slavery in de Montfort is off-putting to many people, although he explains that would be one of the areas where he does an apologetic for why that is, because from a human point of view, we understand exactly as odious as we consider the term slavery to be today, that over the millennia in the human condition, it was that idea of ownership and absolute right. And in actuality, if you get down to the basis of, although God gave us our freedom to make our own choices, he does have an absolute right over us. And so he explains that at depth. I think for a more modern reader, it might be good to start with the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And read what is said about Our Lady, or any of the popular writings. I've mentioned Scott Hahn and others. They're quite abundant on the internet.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.